Hey there, friends. Pastor Cliff Wall, Cold Springs Church. Hope you're having a wonderful Wednesday. Sorry we missed you last week. We were on vacation, family vacation last week. Had a great time, but it's good to be back and able to share a word with you today. I've been trying to talk about how we can understand the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that if we make too sharp of a distinction between the Old and the New Testament, then we will end up misinterpreting both. And there's promises, there's patterns, there's precepts, there's predictions and prophecies that we find in the Old Testament that find their ultimate consummation and fulfillment in the New. And in the fulfillment of those promises and precepts and patterns and predictions and prophecies that we find in the Old, we find the full meaning of and understand the full meaning of them also in the New Testament. So when we talk about how the New Testament is the fulfillment, or we find the fulfillment of the patterns and promises and precepts and prophecies and predictions of the Old, we find the full meaning of these things also in their fulfillment that we see in the New Testament. And so when we're talking about fulfillment in the New Testament, we're not just talking about pinpoint predictions, but fulfillment of the overall patterns and meaning behind those things that we find in the Old Testament. And so there are things that we find that are compared from the Old Testament in the New Testament. And one of those things is the days of Noah. We see this in Matthew chapter 24, and it's talking about the second coming of Jesus Christ. And it compares it to the days of Noah. In verse 37, for example, it says, "For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away," or took them all away. "So will be the coming of the Son of Man." And then it goes on to say, "Then two men will be in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, one will left. Therefore stay away, for you do not know on what day the Lord is coming." And so the comparison here to the days of Noah and those being some being taken and some being left has been misunderstood because of a relatively new, last 150 years or so, there's a relatively new end times teaching. Eschatology is a big word that people use to talk about end times. But there's been a new teaching that has led many to interpret this passage to mean that being left is a bad thing and being taken is a good thing. But actually, the comparison here is to the days of Noah when some were taken in the flood. That was a bad thing, obviously. And those who were left were Noah and his family. They were saved from the judgment of God that came upon the earth in those days because of their trust and their faith and their faithfulness to God. And so being left behind in this particular case is actually a good thing. And so we find here a pattern that finds its ultimate fulfillment. There's a comparison between the days of Noah and the judgment of God that came in those days and its fulfillment of that pattern that we find in the New Testament as it's compared to the second coming of Jesus. Jesus taught this himself. So that's one thing we can see in this pattern is that being taken is being taken in judgment here. Not a good thing. Being left is to be preserved, to live in the new heaven and the new earth. As a matter of fact, 2 Peter chapter 3 also shows this pattern of the comparison between the days of Noah, when the heavens and the earth in that day where judgment was brought upon the whole earth, and God began again with a new beginning with Noah and his family. And there will, again, at the second coming of Jesus, there will be a new beginning for the whole world that will be the final and ultimate new beginning that will usher in the new heaven and the new earth in which there is no more sin and no more sorrow, therefore, thereby. So this pattern we find in different places where there's a comparison made between the days of Noah and the second coming of Jesus. So understanding a little bit better about what was going on in the days of Noah helps us to understand the end times that we need to be aware of and signs of the end time signs. We're in the end times, and we have been in the end times since the day of Pentecost. The last days began with the beginning of the church. But what will be the final consummation of all things and the things leading up to it, there's going to be a similarity between what was going on in the days of Noah. Now, if you go back to Genesis 6 and look at what was leading up to that coming judgment, we find that there were supernatural beings, angelic beings, who had crossed boundaries and were leading people into rebellion and sin. Very strange story about Nephilim, giants, and hybrids, and so on and so forth. But Jude also shows the comparison here and talks about that in Jude as well, about how there were sexual boundaries that were crossed in Noah's day. And he also brings in the pattern of Sodom and Gomorrah. We read about that after the flood in the days of Abraham. We talked about Abraham. But there's a pattern there in that story of Sodom and Gomorrah. As a matter of fact, Luke 16, talking about the comparison of the days of Noah to the second coming, also brings in the pattern of Sodom and Gomorrah. And a pattern there is the judgment of God coming on the earth and being ready and being prepared. And so the early church and the early teachings of the church, there was a comparison made between the ark and the church. Having faith in Christ brings a person into the church, and in the church, having faith in Christ saves one from the judgment that's coming on the earth. So what we can find in this comparison here, in this pattern that finds its ultimate fulfillment in the New Testament and the second coming of Christ, is that crossing sexual boundaries. Jude brings this out with the story of Noah, but also the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in different ways. That will precipitate the coming judgment of God on the earth. And of course, not a popular thing to talk about today, because that very thing has been very prominent in our society, at least. And it's an indication that the things that were happening in the days of Noah, also the days of Sodom and Gomorrah, will be a sign leading up to the second coming of Christ and God's judgment coming on the earth. Even if we're not there at that very, very precipice of the final judgment, the judgment of God can still fall on any given society at any point in history because of these patterns of rebellion that continue to repeat themselves throughout history. But there is a way to understand the relationship between the old and the new, and how the new brings about the final fulfillment of the patterns that we find in the Old Testament. Another word for pattern is type. Some people will talk about the types and the shadows, and it's the symbolism of these things and the meaning behind the symbols and the symbolism of these things that we find their ultimate fulfillment and the revelation of their ultimate meaning we find in the life, death, ascension, and second coming of Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God. And so this is another way we can see the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, how the Old Testament helps us to understand what's going on with the New Testament. And so the days of Noah are very, very important. 2 Peter chapter 3 also, if you look at that, he talks about the pattern there that we find of the heaven and the earth that was before the days of Noah, that was destroyed. But God allowed for a new beginning by preserving and by allowing Noah and his family to be left behind so that they could begin again, and that there will be another judgment of God that will come upon the earth. There won't be another flood, a worldwide flood, but there will be a judgment of God that will bring a renewal and usher in a new heaven and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness, wherein there is no more sin and therefore no more sorrow or sighing. When the ultimate final judgment of God comes, and that those who are in faith and those like Noah who trust God will be preserved and will be left behind, which is a good thing, to begin again in a new heaven and a new earth where there will never ever be any more sin or sorrow again. And that's one of the ways that God has revealed how He brings about renewal and restoration and gives people opportunity. You know, one of the things that we find here is that the flood of Noah's day took people by surprise because they weren't ready and they didn't hear, and really, most importantly, they didn't heed the warning that Noah would have given, and so they would have had an opportunity to come into safety, to be left behind, to be preserved, if you will, with the story of Noah. But there was a day that came where the door of the ark was closed and the opportunity of the lost was lost. And so there's a warning here we find. He says, therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day the Lord is coming. And so that's a way we can see the relationship between the old and the new, and how the new brings the pattern that we find in the old to its ultimate fulfillment. So we'll talk about next week another pattern that we see find its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus, and we'll look at the story of the Exodus. So God bless you. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and I look forward to seeing you next week. God bless you.